I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 11, Black Moss. The results were not promising. But with Luo Wen's limited knowledge of entomology, he couldn't be certain if insects even possessed such things. And even if they did, what would be the point? Setting aside whether there were others of his kind, what could he possibly do engage in some dubious reproductive activities with another insect? Moreover, in his memory, male insects usually met tragic ends. A children's film he watched growing up, one featuring a cat as the protagonist, contained certain scenes that remained a haunting shadow of his childhood. Shuddering, he forcibly interrupted the trajectory of his thoughts. Previously, he had assumed that the tiny opening at the tip of his rear end was an excretory outlet. That opening had been lost along with the 3 tail segments he had shed. Unexpectedly, a new one had secretly grown back, though it had remained unused and unnoticed. But even this time, it wasn't utilized. Instead, a small opening appeared in the middle of his lower abdomen for excretion, leaving the purpose of the rear end opening still a mystery. Drinking water to fill his stomach was barely effective, so Luo Wen turned his attention to the black moss-like plants around him. Were they poisonous? And how resistant was his insect body to toxins? Considering the grandiose name and reputation of his species, his reckless curiosity began to stir. A small taste shouldn't be an issue, right? He cautiously moved closer, using his burrowing legs to scratch at the black moss a couple of times. Nothing unusual happened. No mysterious gas released, no unknown liquid sprayed out, and the hairs on his limbs showed no signs of corrosion. He extended his mouthparts and lightly touched the black moss. No reaction. Then he used his small tongue to lick it. After waiting for a while, there was no numbness at the tip of his tongue. Finally, he carefully took a tiny bite, lying still afterward as a precaution. He experienced no ill effects. After gradually increasing the amount he consumed and lengthening the waiting period between tests, Luo Wen concluded that the black moss were edible and non-toxic or toxic, but harmless to him. While the energy provided by plants couldn't compare to that from meat, it was certainly better than merely drinking water. After eating his fill, Luo Wen climbed up out of the crevice to rest. The walls of the fissure became smoother the deeper he went. His clawed limbs weren't well suited for traversing or resting on such smooth surfaces. Going deeper posed significant risks. If he lost his grip and fell, landing on rock might be manageable. But if he plunged into the underground river, who knew if he could swim? If not, that would be disastrous. Most insects have specialized tracheal systems and unique operational mechanisms, making it difficult to suffocate them but relatively easy to drown them. Unfortunately, Luo Wen's current body used such a conventional system. If he fell into the water, would Ifisha's adaptability allow him to evolve a new system in time to survive? Luo Wen decided that anyone else was welcome to try such challenges. He certainly wouldn't. The first rule etched into his code of conduct was, don't court death. Although Luo Wen aspired to grow powerful in isolation before venturing out, this clearly wasn't realistic. While the area provided food, the efficiency of sustenance was low. As his size increased, he'd likely spend most of each day just eating. Additionally, the black moss couldn't add new genetic elements to his abilities. Staying here would merely enlarge his current form proportionally, without gaining any new functions. Furthermore, he needed to learn more about this world. He couldn't just assume invincibility and recklessly roam, only to be met with a missile or disintegration spell right away. It was essential to observe while he was still inconspicuous. After much deliberation, Luo Wen devised a compromise. He would follow the underground river's flow to wherever it led. Water is the source of life, and he believed that following it would eventually lead him to other forms of life. However, leaving this place meant he might never avenge the ants' attack. Not that Luo Wen was particularly vengeful, of course. He reassured himself it was merely a casual reflection. And so, he embarked on a long journey along the underground river. His days became a routine of eating, drinking, traveling, and resting in cycles. Occasionally, he would climb upward to search for any relatives of the white insect, but alas, he found none. He avoided returning to the surface for now. His brief experiences there had been exceedingly unpleasant. The first time, he had only suffered minor burns, but the next 2 times nearly cost him his life. As he continued along the underground river, its elevation gradually rose. The riverbed, once 50 to 60 meters below the surface, was now only about 20 meters deep. Luo Wen's body had also regrown to the size of a fingernail. Honestly, his growth was slower than he had anticipated. Besides the low energy conversion efficiency of his diet, most of his energy was expended on the heavy labor of digging. He also suspected that his oxygen supply system was a significant limiting factor in his growth. He desperately needed a new, more robust oxygen delivery mechanism to replace the current one. Time passed in unknown measure. The riverbed continued to rise, drawing nearer to the surface, while the rocky layer he traversed came to within a few meters of the ground. Soil began to mix with the rock, and the layer of sand and gravel thinned to almost nothing. Occasionally, plant roots appeared, weaving through the soil. Luo Wen sensed that he might soon leave the desert. When the rock layer was only a meter below the surface, the sand and gravel vanished entirely, leaving just soil. Plant roots grew thicker and more numerous here, indicating an abundance of vegetation above. Yet, he found no sign of white insects. Unable to resist, Luo Wen finally tunneled out of the soil to the surface for a look. His large, bulbous eyes finally proved useful, capturing the surrounding landscape with startling clarity. His field of vision extended to nearly 20 meters, seemingly having strengthened unnoticed. Clusters of unknown shrubs dotted the land, interspersed with wind-blown sand, now reduced to a minor component. Despite the vegetation, the area still felt barren. He saw no trace of insects or animals. It was daytime. The scorching sun beat down on Luo Wen, but instead of the searing pain he'd felt before, he found the warmth rather pleasant. His fire resistance had clearly improved. Cautiously, he crept to the nearest shrub. Its thick yellow-white trunk twisted upward, sprouting numerous slender branches adorned with countless tiny green leaves. It looked delicious. The black moss from underground had long disappeared, likely needing the deep subterranean environment to grow. Luo Wen had spent 2 days surviving on water alone before coming across scattered tree roots. The juice extracted from these roots barely sustained him, with just enough surplus to scrape by. Sticking to his plan, Luo Wen continued following the underground river. After all, seeking alternatives in such an environment carried significant risks. Gradually, the roots became more abundant, until they were omnipresent. Luo Wen no longer had to worry about food, but a new problem arose. Chapter 12, Stink Bug. The distance between the rocky layer and the surface was now less than 2 meters. This was not good news for Luo Wen. His advantage lay underground. In this unfamiliar world, among all the creatures he had encountered, he was the fastest mover underground thanks to his burrowing limbs. So far, however, he had only seen 2 types of creatures, white grubs and yellow earth ants. On the surface, his speed could only rank second. The difference between first and second was significant. The first position indicated no other creatures for comparison, while the second implied that at least one creature was faster than him. Being fast was a critical survival trait in moments of crisis. Thus, underground, his safety level was much higher than on the surface. But now, his strategic depth was less than 2 meters. What good was speed? He would reach the end as soon as he started running, and the end would be a dead end. While horizontal movement was still possible, if the enemy came in swarms, he could still be surrounded. Take the ants, for example, their numbers were never an issue, and this left him feeling deeply insecure. Therefore, he decided to change his strategy. Given the current trend, with the subterranean water table rising, vegetation was becoming denser and more abundant. Similarly, more and more creatures would appear. If he continued blindly burrowing, he might very well dig himself into an enemy encirclement. He needed to slow down, gather more information, and plan his next steps accordingly. This location, devoid of any insects or animals besides shrubs, suited him perfectly. It was like playing a survival game. He was advancing cautiously, ensuring no enemies approached from behind. But before anything else, he had to fill his stomach. The tender green leaves on these shrubs were exceptionally fresh. After multiple thorough tests to confirm they were non-toxic, Luo Wen finally indulged himself. Judging by the abundance of these shrubs, their leaves would likely be his staple food for the foreseeable future. They were worth the effort to verify. With his belly full and the sun no longer a threat, Luo Wen wasted no time. He immediately got back to work. He had barely crawled out before suffering his first attack. Luo Wen had been highly vigilant. His compound eyes, typically well protected during digging, demonstrated extraordinary abilities. Their high resolution made the attacker unmistakable, a creature that was long and sleek, like an oversized earthworm. It suddenly shot out from the soil, its plump cylindrical body resembling a tubular sac aiming to engulf him. Its exact appearance remained unclear from Luo Wen's perspective, as all he saw was a massive mouth lined with rows upon rows of fine, sharp teeth spiraling inward, extending deep into its dark, hollow body. The sight was enough to make one's skin crawl. Thanks to the high refresh rate of his compound eyes, the giant worm's originally rapid movements seemed significantly slower, giving Luo Wen ample time to react. With a slight sidestep, he avoided the attack. Missing its target, the giant worm retracted into the soil, acting as if nothing had happened. Neither side suffered any injuries, and they should have been able to call it even. However, Luo Wen wasn't one to hold grudges, or so it seemed. He deliberately entered the worm's attack range multiple times, and each time, it sprang out to attack without fail. Thanks to the worm's cooperation, Luo Wen quickly gathered enough data. First, its intelligence was low. This was immediately apparent. Next, its body functioned like a spring. It remained compressed underground and sprang out swiftly when prey approached. However, its attack range was limited to the radius of its half-body length in front of it. Lastly, it relied on sound and subtle vibrations to locate prey. With this in mind, Luo Wen burrowed underground, approaching the worm from below. The creature's weaknesses were too glaring. The fact that it hadn't gone extinct yet was nothing short of miraculous. Although its attacks were swift due to its spring-like mechanism, it was only effective when lying in wait as a trap. Against someone like Luo Wen, who played by his own rules, it stood no chance. When Luo Wen bit into the worm from below, it had only managed to turn halfway. This was a pure display of intellectual superiority. But Luo Wen felt no sense of achievement. This creature's intelligence was unlikely to comprehend what superiority even meant. Showing off to a fool was pointless. However, he realized that if even a dimwit like this could set a trap to hunt prey, it suggested that there were even dimmer creatures nearby. Initially, Luo Wen worried that with his current equipment, he might have to lie low for a while as a vegetarian insect. Unexpectedly, a fool had jumped out to reassure him that he could continue being a carnivorous bug. The oversized worm had no exoskeletal armor. Its tough yet pliant skin was no match for Luo Wen's sharp mandibles. With just one bite, Luo Wen tore through the worm's body. Blackish-brown fluid oozed from the wound, and his suctorial mouthparts latched onto it. Blat, blat, blat. The moment the liquid entered his esophagus, Luo Wen spat repeatedly, trying to expel it. Although he managed to spit out most of it, some had already entered his stomach. A rancid mud-like stench filled his mouth. It was utterly revolting. Luo Wen considered himself a bug of simple tastes. He had even licked stones before, but this creature delivered a critical blow to his palate. This creature was likely the dumbest in the area. It probably survived by eating dirt and set traps merely to pass the time. The fact that it had lived this long without going extinct was entirely due to its disgusting taste. It perfectly embodied the principle, if I evolve to be inedible enough, no predator will bother with me. Luo Wen shook his head repeatedly, silently vowing to steer clear of it. Its flavor was so off-putting that he nearly developed an eating disorder. He resolved not to eat anything for the rest of the day. Turning his back on the worm, he quickened his pace and left, unable to stomach even the sight of it. If the worm had any useful genetic fragments, Luo Wen would have forced himself to eat it despite the gag reflex. Unfortunately, while the countless fine teeth had some appeal, its nauseating quality was something even a undiscerning bug like Luo Wen found unacceptable. Even if he could stomach it, the ability was pointless. It was the product of countless generations of self-sacrifice by the worm's ancestors, embedding their stench into the DNA of nearby predators. To illustrate, if Luo Wen had offspring, he'd definitely tell them to steer clear of these creatures. Descending into the rocky layer, Luo Wen crawled into a crevice. After drinking his fill of water and relieving himself, he finally managed to rid himself of the foul taste. Luo Wen realized he had been careless again. He still lacked sufficient experience as a bug. His antennae had taste sensors, and he resolved to taste test prey with them next time. For now, he had no energy for further exploration. He decided to rest for a while before continuing his journey. Chapter 13, Watching the Show. When Luo Wen crawled back to the surface, it was already nighttime. The cool moonlight bathed the land, with a thin layer of frost on the ground reflecting a crystalline glow. Luo Wen didn't feel much of a chill. After all, he had no idea how far he'd traveled from his original location. It was possible that the nighttime temperatures here weren't as low. Or maybe his cold resistance had increased. Either way, the constant change of scenery made it difficult to draw any definitive conclusions. Two light sources still hung high in the sky. Although Luo Wen couldn't see them clearly, he could faintly discern their positions and colors. One was white with a slight yellowish hue, while the other was tinged with red. The yellow-white one appeared several times larger than the red one. The cold wind blew through the silence of the night. No insect chirps or other sounds could be heard, creating an eerie and somewhat terrifying atmosphere. With his 6 striding limbs crunching lightly on the frost, Luo Wen advanced cautiously, producing faint sounds and vibrations as he explored. The surrounding shrubs had folded their green leaves tightly against their branches, making the originally yellowish-white branches look like they were wearing green coats. Luo Wen guessed that this might be a unique adaptation for retaining warmth. Since he encountered no trouble, no giant earthworm relatives or friends, he managed to make significant progress despite his slow pace. Previously, he had stayed directly above the underground river to quickly gather food and water. But as the riverbed rose, Luo Wen shifted slightly away to maintain a sufficient strategic depth underground. Now, he was several hundred meters from the riverbed, running parallel to it. This way, he remained close enough to water while having enough soil above him for safety. On this alien planet, Luo Wen still couldn't figure out the rotational and orbital systems. The timekeeping methods from his previous world no longer applied here. He had been crawling for a long time, yet the sky remained unchanged. The sun showed no signs of starting its shift. Feeling his energy reserves drop to nearly half, Luo Wen stopped moving forward. In this unfamiliar and dangerous environment, he didn't dare exhaust his strength completely. He always stopped with about half his energy left, reserving it for potential emergencies. After munching on some food from the shrub roots, he burrowed deep underground to rest. After several days of slow advancement, the number of surface plants increased, and their variety became richer. The last time Luo Wen crawled to the surface, it was broad daylight. Not long after he started moving, he stumbled upon a dramatic scene. A massive black insect, easily over 10 times his size and roughly the size of a human palm, was surrounded by dozens of ant-like black insects. The black insect had a flat head with an exaggerated pair of giant mandibles. Its segmented body, viewed from the back, was armored with thick exoskeleton plates. Its 6 short limbs made it appear very low to the ground, and a pair of slender antennae extended from either side of its mandibles. The black ants surrounding it seemed unremarkable in appearance. They lacked the exaggerated hooks and massive mandibles of the yellow earth ants Luo Wen had previously encountered and didn't resort to fecal attacks. Their abilities, if any, were yet to be revealed. At that moment, both sides were locked in a tense standoff, with the battle on the brink of erupting. The massive black beetle strolled leisurely, seemingly indifferent to the tiny ants encircling it. The black ants, on the other hand, held their positions, as if waiting for reinforcements. It made sense, these black ants were smaller than Luo Wen, so why would they think challenging such a behemoth was a good idea? Luo Wen's advantage became evident in this situation. Although his compound eyes would have been considered nearsighted by human standards, they were essentially eagle-eyed compared to other insects. From a safe distance, he observed the confrontation without alerting either side. As long as he avoided making too much noise, they wouldn't notice him. Among insects, poor eyesight often meant that other sensory systems were highly developed. Neither side of this confrontation was something Luo Wen could afford to provoke. He had learned a painful lesson last time he tried to spectate a conflict, losing his self-made nest and being forced into exile for so long. Despite swearing back then that he would never watch another fight, Luo Wen couldn't help himself when presented with the opportunity. Fine, so he'd be a dog, for watching dogs were far stronger than this fingernail-sized bug he'd become. Still, he had learned one thing: don't get too close while spectating. Watch from a safe distance to avoid getting dragged into the fray. The ants gradually tightened their encirclement, agitating the black beetle. It lost its calm demeanor, brandishing its massive mandibles in preparation for an attack. The tension reached a breaking point. Unable to endure any longer, the black beetle charged forward, snapping its mandibles around one of the black ants. In an instant, the ant was decapitated. Its body fell to the ground in 2 pieces. Even after its head and torso separated, its antennae and limb segments twitched reflexively. The opening move was swift and deadly, clean and decisive. Luo Wen felt his blood pumping and couldn't help but cheer internally. The death of one of their kind enraged the black ants, prompting them to launch a full-scale assault. The battle quickly turned fierce. Although the black ants had overwhelming numbers, their slender limbs and small bodies gave them few advantages. Only their sharp mandibles were noteworthy, but these were of little use against the heavily armored beetle. The black beetle, on the other hand, resembled an unstoppable war machine. Its massive mandibles were unstoppable, anything caught in their grip had no chance of survival. Leaving behind an intact corpse was a rarity. However, its mandibles had a design flaw. Like two interlocking sevens, they could only deliver their devastating bite at the tips. The ant's small size and agile movements made it difficult for the beetle to land precise attacks. As a result, while its attacks were lethal, the fight remained evenly matched. Still, the occasional unlucky ant would fall victim, leaving scattered body parts around the battlefield. Despite their numerical advantage, the ants were slowly losing ground. Without reinforcements, their complete defeat was only a matter of time. Realizing this, the ants changed their tactics. Instead of gnawing futilely on the beetle's thick carapace, the ants climbed its back to target its eyes and antennae, key vulnerabilities that could render it blind and deaf. Meanwhile, the ants on the ground focused their attacks on the beetle's clawed limbs. Though its heavy armor protected most of its joints, the exposed claw tips became the primary targets. The tactical shift was immediately effective. The beetle's once dominant assault became restrained and defensive. It now devoted most of its energy to shaking off ants from its back and dodging attacks at its feet. Watching from a distance, Luo Wen cursed the ants for their dishonorable, underhanded tactics. Chapter 14, Picking up the Scraps. The ants intertwined their bodies, forming a net that entangled the black beetle. The beetle struggled more and more to shake off the ants, and the tide of battle shifted from a one-sided massacre to an uncertain outcome. If there had been bets placed, this would surely go down as a tragic spectacle. After losing 2 claw tips and half an antenna, the black beetle finally chose to retreat. Continuing the fight would likely lead to its death, but if it decided to flee, the ant's slender frames couldn't stop it. Like a heavy tank crashing through infantry lines, the black beetle charged away with ants clinging to its body, scattering some along the way due to sheer speed. Since Luo Wen had been observing from a great distance, the beetle quickly disappeared beyond his sight, ants still riding on it. Luo Wen didn't linger idly. Why had he been watching all this time? Besides the entertainment, he harbored the hope of scavenging something useful from the battlefield. Now that both sides had left, the area was littered with loot. Passing up such an opportunity wasn't Luo Wen's style. He scrambled up and quickly scuttled toward the battlefield. Though it was only a dozen meters away, a mere few steps for his human-sized self, it was a marathon for his fingernail-sized body. Fortunately, Luo Wen had anticipated scavenging from the start. While spectating, he had planned his route to the battlefield and checked for potential dangers along the way. Nothing seemed amiss on the surface, but the hidden ambush tactics of the dim-witted earthworm earlier taught him to be cautious. Predators employing stealthy hunting methods were hard to spot until it was too late. So, as he raced forward, Luo Wen kept an eye on the ground beneath him to avoid a tragic mishap. Luckily, he reached the battlefield safely. His suctorial mouth wasn't suited for quickly consuming meat, so he grabbed a piece of an ant's lower body, raised his rear, and burrowed underground. After digging a small hole deep below to store the food, Luo Wen returned twice more, retrieving a severed head and a torso. But when he emerged a third time, a few ants were already beginning to return to the battlefield. Not wanting to risk it, he retreated to the underground. Carrying the ant remnants, Luo Wen burrowed deeper, creating a small chamber and carving out several escape routes. He also gathered some roots for extra sustenance. Once everything was set, he finally began his meal, hoping for some useful gains. It took him a long time to thoroughly lick the ant meat clean, leaving behind a pile of discarded exoskeleton shells. Luo Wen set them aside and went to rest with high expectations. When he awoke, he ignored his hunger and the low energy alerts from his reserves, rushing to examine his body. He inspected his antennae, eyes, limbs, and carapace. None showed any changes. Disappointed, Luo Wen recalled that the black ants hadn't displayed any special abilities during the fight. He shouldn't have hoped for too much. He pouted in frustration, then noticed something unusual about his mouth. Was something different? Unfortunately, his mouth was one of the blind spots in his compound eye's field of vision. Carefully, he used a limb to probe and feel with its fine bristles. Oh, if only he had a mirror, this wouldn't be such a hassle. Suddenly, inspiration struck. His mouth must have changed because of the black ants. It was likely similar to their mouths. The empty ant head was still lying nearby. Luo Wen approached it for a closer look. Comparing the sensations from his bristles with the specimen in front of him, Luo Wen reached a conclusion. My mouth finally got an upgrade, he exclaimed. Luo Wen had long harbored a grudge against his previous suctorial mouth. Why couldn't he have been given something more capable at the start? Instead, he had been stuck with a mouth made for soft foods, a freeloader's mouth, as he called it. Now, his new mouth resembled the black ant's chewing type mouthparts. The mushroom-like shape of his original mouth was gone, replaced by structures like multiple lip plates, mandibles, labial palps, and sclerites. These components could shovel food into his mouth as if a ring of tiny hands had grown around it. Quite the mental image. Though chewing mouthparts were the most basic type for insects, with suctorial mouthparts being an evolution from them, this wasn't necessarily a regression. Sometimes, the simplest tools were the most versatile, and what suited him best was what mattered. It was a bright and sunny day. The familiar shrubs had unfolded their green leaves. With the underground river rising closer to the surface, vegetation grew denser, covering the ground with rotting leaves rather than yellow sand. Luo Wen crawled through the underground for some time, putting distance between himself and the battlefield above. Finally, he pushed aside a layer of fallen leaves and emerged. The chirps of unseen insects filled the shrubs. Compared to the desolate desert, this area felt far livelier. Of course, this also meant greater danger. After crawling a short distance, Luo Wen's antennae picked up some unusual sounds from a shrub nearby. Turning to look, he saw what appeared to be a relative of yesterday's war god beetle munching on leaves. The sounds were coming from it. This black beetle was even larger than the one from yesterday and had intact limbs. That was how Luo Wen immediately knew it wasn't the same beetle. But to his surprise, this mighty warrior, a juggernaut capable of taking on multiple enemies, was a vegetarian. Luo Wen was stunned. It was like seeing a heavily armored knight wielding a massive sword, drenched in blood after slaying foes, return to cheers only to grin and say, "Actually, I'm just cosplaying." Luo Wen felt a wave of dismay. As a self-identified carnivorous insect, being utterly outclassed in size and equipment by a plant-eater left him in a bad mood. Before he could vent his frustration, he noticed movement near the beetle. A piece of bark seemed to shift. Focusing intently, Luo Wen saw a pair of slender antennae twitching at the edge of the bark. It wasn't bark at all, it was an insect. Still recovering from the shock of the vegetarian revelation, Luo Wen was stunned again. Was this some kind of camouflage tech? What was this bug's deal? His knowledge of entomology was clearly lacking. He'd heard of chameleons but never of shape-shifting bugs. The camouflage had some minor flaws, but without movement, it was nearly undetectable. As the wind rustled the leaves and branches, producing soft noises, the disguised insect crept closer to the oblivious beetle under the cover of sound. After a few minutes, it was just a step away from the beetle's rear. The black beetle remained unaware, but Luo Wen, watching from afar, felt his heart tighten. What was this camouflage bug planning? Chapter 15, Take the Risk. Under Luo Wen's ultra-high-resolution compound eyes, the camouflage bug had already revealed its true form. Somehow, it had strapped a piece of bark to its back that didn't fall off. Its actual body was a slender, wingless insect resembling a mosquito magnified dozens of times. What was this weakling, with barely any exoskeletal armor, trying to do? Was it planning to challenge the war god one-on-one? That was pure suicide. Luo Wen couldn't help but ridicule, forgetting that he had once been an equally defenseless creature with an unprotected abdomen. Suddenly, the camouflage bug, now behind the black beetle, extended its coiled mouthpart. The organ straightened to a length nearly equal to its entire body, resembling a steel needle. The steel-like needle slipped slowly into the crevice between the black beetle's shoulder plate and back armor. Yet the beetle remained completely unresponsive. Moments later, the camouflage bug's thin, shriveled abdomen began to swell. The black beetle, though outwardly unchanged, gradually stopped chewing on leaves. This world is insanely dangerous. Luo Wen cursed internally. The black beetle had been the most imposing and majestic bug Luo Wen had encountered so far. Just yesterday, it had shown off its prowess by taking on multiple opponents single-handedly. Yet today, it was effortlessly taken out by a sneaky assassin. This shattered Luo Wen's perception of strength. He had quietly set the black beetle as his next evolution goal. Its sheer size, dozens of times larger than his own, was intimidating enough. But now, this imposing beetle was slain by a sneaky camouflage bug. If anything, this suggested that strength was relative. Luo Wen figured that had the black beetle spotted its assailant earlier, it would have crushed the camouflage bug easily. The outcome of their encounter had depended entirely on the element of surprise. So, what did it mean to be strong? Luo Wen pondered this question. Even if he could someday kill a black beetle, what would stop another bug from emerging to counter him? He thought of a movie from his human days about a superhero with an indestructible body, laser vision, freezing breath, supersonic speed, telescopic sight, and super hearing. Even that being had a weapon capable of neutralizing it. Honestly, Luo Wen felt a bit lost. Would the evolution of an individual ever have an endpoint? And even if there were one, could an individual's strength alone reach it? After some thought, Luo Wen dismissed the idea. He was just a bug the size of a fingernail. Worrying about such things was ridiculous. Survival came first. The camouflage bug, its needle-like mouthpart now soft and coiled, perched motionlessly on the bark again, its massively swollen belly rendering its camouflage ineffective. After careful observation and calculations, Luo Wen decided to take a gamble. The camouflage bug's only real threat was its mouthpart. While its size was much larger, Luo Wen believed he had an 80% chance of victory with caution. If things went south, its bloated body would likely hinder it enough for him to escape. Luo Wen couldn't account for every possible variable, nor could he plan a flawless strategy. But 80% was good enough for him to make his move. Time was life. Having made up his mind, he didn't hesitate. He darted toward the camouflage bug, which, overly confident in its disguise, remained still as Luo Wen approached. Taking advantage of its complacency, Luo Wen scurried under the bark it used as a shield. Bracing himself with his middle and rear legs, he lunged forward, sinking his jaws into the bug's neck. Luo Wen had no weapons besides his two mandibles. Against the much larger camouflage bug, his bite wouldn't threaten most parts of its body. But the thin neck was an exception. Catching the camouflage bug off guard, Luo Wen seized the opportunity. His attack landed on the most critical spot. Panicked, the camouflage bug flailed its long, spindly limbs wildly, sending both of them tumbling off the tree trunk. They wrestled on the rotting, foul-smelling ground. The camouflage bug repeatedly extended and retracted its mouthpart, aiming to pierce Luo Wen. Luo Wen wasn't about to make things easy. Every claw on his body clung tightly to the bug, keeping him locked onto its neck. No matter how the bug twisted and turned, Luo Wen held firm, immovable. Due to Luo Wen's small size and his position, the camouflage bug's attacks missed their mark repeatedly. Gradually, the connection between its head and body grew weaker. Its head drooped, and its struggles ceased, though its body twitched reflexively. Luo Wen held his position for a while longer, only releasing when he was sure the camouflage bug was dead. A gamble well taken. Now, it was time to reap the rewards. Before feasting, Luo Wen climbed back up the tree to check on the black beetle. As he suspected, while its claws still clung to the branch, its insides were hollow, its muscles and organs liquefied and drained by the camouflage bug. Satisfied that the beetle was truly dead, Luo Wen returned to the camouflage bug's corpse. Despite its large size, most of its body consisted of its elongated, shriveled frame. Without its swollen abdomen, it probably had less meat than a white grub. The bark on its back accounted for much of its apparent size. It had adhered so tightly that even their violent battle hadn't dislodged it. Clearly, the camouflage bug was a seasoned ambusher. Initially, Luo Wen had thought it might possess a chameleon-like camouflage ability. Instead, it relied entirely on external tools. Poor bugs evolve, rich bugs use gear, Luo Wen joked to himself. Could this bug be an aristocrat among insects? While amusing, the thought reminded Luo Wen that some bugs were highly intelligent. Humanity had risen to dominance on Earth through tool use. He couldn't afford to underestimate other species just because of encounters with dim-witted creatures like the stink bug. After devouring the camouflage bug's flesh, it was time for the main course. As a former human, Luo Wen found the thought of eating the bug's swollen abdomen revolting. But pickiness wasn't an option. What was normal food for insects had to become normal for him. Though he understood this logically, actually doing it was another matter. His jaws opened and closed hesitantly, unable to commit. Chapter 16, New Changes. The environment here was complex and riddled with danger, leaving Luo Wen no time to adjust his mindset leisurely. He stopped hesitating, convincing himself that it was just like drinking bubble tea. With his eyes closed, he used his twin mandibles to bite a small opening into the camouflage bug's swollen belly. Thick liquid began to ooze from the wound. His newly adapted chewing mouthparts sealed over the opening, and his mandibular lobes opened and closed, sucking up every drop of the liquid. Once past the psychological barrier, Luo Wen found that, to a bug's palate, the taste was actually quite pleasant. After all, it was essentially a distillation of the black beetle's muscles, concentrated into a rich broth. It was akin to a chicken soup that had simmered for 3 days, packed with all the essence. Unfortunately, Luo Wen had recently replaced his siphoning mouthparts, which would have been ideal as a straw. Now, it felt more like drinking from a packet of juice, biting a small hole in the corner and slowly draining the contents. Occasionally, small chunks like pearls, grass jelly, or fruit bits in bubble tea would slip through, providing a chewy delight. He hoped this analogy would help readers enjoy their bubble tea more effectively. As the camouflage bug's swollen belly deflated, Luo Wen's digestive system went into overdrive, accelerating the processing of the liquid. Although this consumed additional energy, the relative sizes of Luo Wen and the camouflage bug made it more efficient to digest the food immediately than risk wasting it. Even with the accelerated digestion, Luo Wen felt overstuffed. This feast contained the essence of both the black beetle and the camouflage bug. While the camouflage bug didn't have much meat, the black beetle's muscle mass even without its shell was several times greater than Luo Wen's body. By the time he finished, Luo Wen could barely walk straight. His bloated abdomen dragged on the ground, forcing him to prop himself up with his legs to move, making his gait extremely awkward. This state left him vulnerable, his already limited speed on the surface was now even worse. Luo Wen couldn't risk becoming another bug's easy prey, so he quickly raised his rear and started digging. Only deep underground could he feel secure. This time, he dug a tunnel larger than usual to avoid compressing his swollen abdomen. His head down, legs up digging posture caused his mouth parts to clamp shut, giving him an appearance akin to wearing a faceplate. Strangely, it made him look a bit more distinguished. Reaching a safe depth, Luo Wen hastily dug out a small chamber. Without bothering to carve escape routes, he fell into a deep sleep. In his dreams, Luo Wen alternated between two identities. In one, he was a towering black war god, invincible against swarms of ants. In the other, he was a sly assassin, cloaked in tools and trickery, dispatching formidable bugs with lethal precision. Deep underground, where few insects could reach, a tiny black bug rested in its hollowed-out chamber. Its body was undergoing a transformation. Time passed how long, Luo Wen couldn't tell. When he finally woke, he was momentarily dazed. It took only a moment to regain his bearings, and he immediately began examining his body. His oversized digging limbs were ill-suited for delicate work, so his second pair of thoracic limbs acted as hands. Their bristled surfaces carefully explored every inch of his body. From top to bottom, he started with his compound eyes, no changes. His chewing mouthparts remained intact, and his digging limbs showed no abnormalities. The number of legs was correct, neither more nor less. A 360-degree scan with his compound eyes revealed no changes to his shoulder plates or back armor. Even his size remained the same, still about the size of a fingernail. Then he felt something odd around his abdomen. Twisting his body, he managed to catch sight of it. Hey? Did I just take a short nap? His abdomen was still swollen and round. Luo Wen, momentarily perplexed, thought the food might not have fully digested. But soon, he noticed something unusual. His abdomen hadn't shrunk, in fact, it had grown larger and longer. What the hell is this thing growing out of me? Luo Wen couldn't help but curse. He had hoped that absorbing the black beetle's essence, even second-hand, might enhance his size or strengthen his exoskeleton. If not, he would have settled for the camouflage bug's bark-adhering ability. At the very least, gaining its needle-like mouthpart would have been acceptable. But now his abdomen had grown wider and longer? Was he so overstuffed that he'd ruined his stomach? For a while, Luo Wen was utterly baffled. Trying to walk around, he found the new appendage severely hindered his speed and agility. It gave him an awkward, off-balance feeling. Not wanting to take any chances, he flipped onto his back and arched his upper body like doing a sit-up to inspect the situation. When he saw it, Luo Wen swore under his breath. It wasn't his abdomen that had enlarged, it was a new growth attached to his rear. Previously, Luo Wen's body followed the standard insect structure: head, thorax, and abdomen. Now, there was a fourth section. His original abdomen had 9 segments, though 3 had been lost in a fight with the yellow earth ants. While the wound had healed, the segments had never regenerated. Now, the remaining 6 segments seemed compressed, as if a spring had been compacted, leaving a smaller abdomen. The newly grown section resembled a swollen version of the original abdomen, complete with segmented rings, which had fooled Luo Wen into thinking it was part of his stomach. This appendage dragged behind him like a trailer, severely limiting his maneuverability. Only upon closer inspection did Luo Wen realize it wasn't his abdomen's fault, it was this new addition causing the problem. What now? Luo Wen muttered. He was already at the lower end of the insect food chain, and now he had an unwieldy burden. Unless he could secure a steady food source like the white grubs, the risk of foraging would skyrocket. After the initial panic, Luo Wen gradually calmed down. Reflecting on his prior evolutions, he realized that every new organ or ability had a purpose. If he could uncover some clues, he might understand this transformation. He recalled how his compound eyes had improved to eliminate nearsightedness, granting him a wider field of view. Later, he had grown digging limbs to enhance his burrowing speed. His mandibles had developed to chew through roots and prey, and his back armor had thickened after losing a fight with the yellow earth ants. Eating the white grub had triggered cocooning for recovery. His most recent change had replaced his siphoning mouth parts with chewing ones. Logically, absorbing the black beetle and camouflage bug's genes should have granted him some of their traits. Even if he didn't inherit the beetle's size or armor, he should have gained something from the camouflage bug. Yet now, after digesting the food and expending so much energy, he had grown an unrelated appendage. Why? Chapter 17, Reflections. Luo Wen reviewed his brief insect life in detail. Thankfully, his experiences weren't extensive. He could recall everything from birth to now in just a short time. Could it be that some dormant genes in his body had been activated? Like his digging limbs? That wasn't impossible. But what was this new appendage good for? The inability to consciously choose which genetic fragments to activate was indeed frustrating. Now he was stuck with something that gave him a headache. At this moment, Luo Wen yearned to grow up and reach maturity, but that was impossible without significant time and energy. Reflecting on his experiences, Luo Wen realized the variety of bugs and food he'd encountered was pitifully small: root sap, white grubs, black moss, ants, black beetles, and camouflage bugs. Wait. Ants? His thoughts paused, rewinding to a potential clue: the ants. He also remembered tasting a bit of that foul-smelling earthworm. Although he spat most of it out, who knew if he might have absorbed some strange genetic fragment from it. But no, the earthworm didn't have anything resembling this appendage, and they were clearly different species. He dismissed the possibility. As for the ants, they didn't have anything like this either. The trail went cold again. Luo Wen refused to believe this oversized rear had appeared for no reason. There had to be a clue somewhere. He recalled that every evolution gave him something he desperately needed. Did he need a giant rear end right now? That was absurd. Suddenly, Luo Wen thought back to the day he witnessed the camouflage bug stealthily kill the black beetle. That had prompted him to ponder a philosophical question for a long time. Could that be the source of his problem? Could an individual alone ever reach the ultimate pinnacle of strength, one that transcends all limitations? On the journey toward such strength, vulnerabilities would always exist, exploitable by various means. So before reaching that ultimate state, did one need the power of a collective? Those questions had left him dizzy back then, and he hadn't arrived at an answer. But if he followed that line of thought further, he came to a terrifying conclusion. Deep down, Luo Wen's subconscious seemed to have answered the question: the power of a collective. Yet here he was, a solitary bug, without even a glimpse of his kind. Where could he possibly find a collective? And so, the answer became clear. But Luo Wen didn't want to accept it. This wasn't the path he wanted. Looking back, it seemed his predecessors had all pursued the path of individual might. He, on the other hand, had no guidance, no teachings, just trial and error. It was no wonder he'd gone astray. Since his predecessors hadn't ventured down this path, there wouldn't be any genetic fragments left behind for it. That meant the problem lay entirely with him. He realized the most likely culprit was the ants. During his encounters with them, he had first picked up the nearest body, then a head on the second trip, and finally, the largest one on his third and final attempt. Could that have been a queen ant's body? Luo Wen wasn't sure, but he knew queens were usually hidden deep within the nest and rarely ventured out. However, he had heard that ants carried dormant queen ant genes. When a queen died, and the suppressive pheromones were no longer present, some ants could transform into new queens. Alternatively, it might have been a queen that had left the colony with her followers, only to be bisected by the black beetle war god. That could explain why the ants had launched a suicidal frenzy to avenge her. This scenario was dramatic enough to be a novel plot. Still, that was how ants behaved back on Earth. Who knew what these local ants were like? Speculating further yielded no definitive answers. And even if he figured it out, the reality remained, it was too late to change anything. Deep down, Luo Wen had chosen the power of a collective. His body, ever so considerate, had solved his problem of being a solitary bug. By giving him a reproductive organ to create his own companions. What Luo Wen truly rejected wasn't the idea of collective power. Honestly, he had grown tired of his cautious, perilous existence and wouldn't mind having a few companions to keep watch for danger. But he couldn't accept the method. Didn't this mean he had become a female bug? This was a blow to his masculine pride, and he refused to compromise. Yet what could he do? The deed was done. Luo Wen felt utterly baffled. The mental effort of grappling with these questions left his head aching. Intellectual work seemed to consume a lot of energy, and he had only just woken up, so he needed to replenish himself. Let's find some food first. Thinking requires energy, Luo Wen muttered. Although he resolved to think after eating, controlling his thoughts was easier said than done. The more he tried not to think, the more his mind wandered. As he dug, Luo Wen's thoughts kept circling. If he were in his mature stage, this would be easy to solve. He could simply regress the organ. But as a juvenile, he lacked that ability. Still, the successful replacement of his siphoning mouthparts with chewing ones gave him hope. Back then, he had loathed his mushroom-like siphoning mouthparts. When new genetic fragments became available, they were immediately replaced. Now, if he rejected the reproductive organ strongly enough, could it regress back to its original state? With a clear plan and goal in mind, Luo Wen's eyes brightened, and he dug with renewed vigor. He avoided the surface. In his current bloated, clumsy state, going above ground would be a death sentence, inviting predators to pounce. Instead, he scavenged some plant roots underground. With his shrunken stomach, he didn't need much food. After quickly filling up, he returned to his makeshift burrow. Still wide awake after his recent sleep, Luo Wen lay on the ground, unable to doze off. He wondered whether the evolution process required sleep to trigger. Could it not activate while he was awake? His mind spun with questions. As the saying goes, true wisdom is concise, while ignorance fills volumes. With a mountain of questions needing answers, Luo Wen lamented that if someone could offer even a shred of guidance, he wouldn't have ended up in this mess where even his gender had been changed. Bored and unable to sleep, he decided to study the new organ. If it couldn't be regressed, he at least needed to understand it. Truth be told, Luo Wen was curious. Curiosity is the driving force of development. For a girl, it's the first step toward liking a boy. For a bug, curiosity about a new organ might lead to surprising discoveries. Driven by this curiosity, Luo Wen lightly probed the organ. It was attached to the end of his abdomen. There was a small opening there, which he had previously assumed was an excretory hole. However, he'd lost the final 3 abdominal segments in a fight, and the hole had disappeared when the wound healed. Now, the hole had inexplicably reappeared, though Luo Wen had only ever expelled water from a hidden opening in the middle of his abdomen. He had never used the one at the rear and had no idea what it was for. Chapter 18, The Birth of the Brood Nest, the Beginning of the Swarm. Luo Wen finally understood the purpose of the small aperture at the rear of his body after a new addition, a massive organ, had connected to it. Through this aperture, Luo Wen could transfer food to the newly formed organ. His abdomen, now compressed like a dense biscuit, could store significantly less food. Most of what he consumed was now transported directly to the new organ, where it was converted into energy. As for what the organ would do with this energy, Luo Wen dared not experiment to find out. He feared the worst. What if it produced an egg? That would be catastrophic. For now, he decided to feign ignorance, leaving room to reverse the situation later. But should his curiosity lead him to confirm his suspicions, the consequences would be unacceptable. Lost in these chaotic thoughts, time passed quickly, and Luo Wen drifted off to sleep. In his dreams, he saw the massive organ behind him open at the end, spewing out tiny insects with a poof, poof sound. Luo Wen, oddly enough, watched them with a benevolent smile. The nightmare was so chilling that it jolted him awake as if drenched in ice water. His whole body froze in terror. If such a thing ever occurred, he'd rather die than live with the shame. It took a long while for him to recover, but his body still felt incredibly drained, a sign of energy depletion. Rather than panic, Luo Wen was overjoyed. This exhaustion meant his body was undergoing another transformation. He checked his head, thorax, and back. No changes. His body size also remained the same. Breathing a sigh of relief, he noted that none of the energy had been wasted on any unwanted mutations. He then turned his attention to his abdomen, where he noticed it had returned to its normal state, no longer compressed. However, to his frustration and anger, the massive organ was still attached to his rear. His mind filled with confusion. Was this some kind of joke? All it had done was restore his abdomen while leaving his body even longer and more cumbersome. What purpose did this serve other than making him an easier target? But then he noticed something peculiar. With a thought, the new organ detached from his body and became a separate entity on the ground. He then repositioned himself, aligning the aperture on his rear with the opening on the organ. With a soft click, the organ reconnected to his body. Luo Wen was dumbfounded, marveling at the ingenuity of evolution. To prevent him from harboring self-destructive thoughts, his body had developed a compromise, turning this organ into a detachable device. All Luo Wen could do was exclaim, "Amazing!" From then on, the organ could function like a machine. In emergencies, he could even drag it behind him like a cart. This ingenious design saved his dignity. No matter what others might think, Luo Wen convinced himself of this explanation and repeatedly hypnotized himself to believe it without question. With the critical issue of dignity resolved, his curiosity about the organ's functions surged. He eagerly began examining it. After some exploration, Luo Wen discovered the following. It was still a living entity and required constant energy to survive. It had its own digestive and energy conversion systems. It could be fed by either connecting it to his aperture or placing food directly into a funnel-shaped opening on its side. Luo Wen decided to forget about the first feeding method. From now on, there was only one way to provide it with food. The organ had no independent consciousness. It was entirely under Luo Wen's control, and his will dictated its actions. This was logical, considering it originated from his body. Luo Wen vowed to keep this fact a strict secret. No matter which part of his body, his head, limbs, or even his rear touched the organ, he could activate its functions. As Luo Wen had guessed, its primary function was to produce small insects. The organ shared all of Luo Wen's genetic material except his evolutionary abilities. It could mix and match his genetic fragments to produce various types of insects. This feature offered an unexpected benefit. Luo Wen now had an indirect way to view the genetic material within his body. For example, he discovered that he had indeed acquired genetic fragments from the black beetle, a pleasant surprise. However, the organ lacked the ability to hunt for its own food. Luo Wen would have to provide all its energy. Even so, Luo Wen couldn't help but exclaim, "Incredible!" Before long, Luo Wen would no longer be alone. He would have his own little brothers. But he couldn't keep calling it the organ. That would reveal too much. It needed a proper name. After some thought, Luo Wen decided to call it Brood Nest, a fitting name. With the name settled, the next step was to test its capabilities. Luo Wen was eager to begin, but his empty stomach forced him to gather food first. Leaving the brood nest alone in the cave made him uneasy. It had no offensive or defensive capabilities. If something wandered in and took a bite out of it, he wouldn't even know where to cry. Reluctantly, Luo Wen reconnected the brood nest to his body and dragged it along as he ventured out. He followed the previous path he had excavated. Although the tunnel had partially collapsed, it was still more convenient than digging a new one. Reaching the roots of an unknown plant, Luo Wen began replenishing his own energy. Once sated, he turned his attention to feeding the brood nest. There was an efficient, straightforward way to do so, but Luo Wen refused to entertain it. Instead, he bit into the plant roots, sucked out some juice, and spat it into the brood nest's funnel. The process was awkward, to say the least. This method was painfully inefficient. After a long time, the brood nest had barely gathered any energy, while Luo Wen was utterly exhausted. Throughout the process, Luo Wen repeatedly checked the brood nest to see if enough material had been stored to produce an insect. His initial design was a small insect based on himself, augmented with the black beetle's powerful genes. The black beetle's oxygen supply system was only slightly more advanced than Luo Wen's, but its muscular system was much more robust, allowing it to distribute oxygen across its massive body. After some thought, Luo Wen decided to create an enhanced version of the black beetle instead. Unfortunately, the energy required to produce such a creature was astronomical. Moreover, the juice from the plant roots was highly inefficient for energy conversion. At Luo Wen's current pace, it would take an eternity to gather enough energy. This was far from the ideal scenario Luo Wen had envisioned. If this continued, the brood nest would be more of a burden than an asset to his growth. Chapter 19, The First Hatching. Luo Wen had envisioned a grand scene, standing before his enemies and shouting, "The sacred F2 binds us swarm, charge!" T/N, F2 is a reference to the game StarCraft, where the F2 button is the select all army button, which is especially helpful for Zerg players. Then, an endless tide of insects would flood forth, engulfing the enemy like a rolling dust storm. However, for now, this vision remained purely in his imagination. Judging by the current situation, he wasn't even sure it would ever come to fruition. Frustrated and weary from feeding the brood nest, Luo Wen bit off a small section of the tree root, carried it back with the brood nest connected to him, and returned to the underground cave. Back at the cave, he stuffed one end of the root into the funnel-shaped intake of the brood nest. The root was long, and much of it stuck out, but Luo Wen decided to leave it that way and let the brood nest digest it slowly. He patted himself on the back for his cleverness. Although this method slowed the brood nest's absorption efficiency, it saved him a great deal of effort, didn't it? Over the next few days, Luo Wen stayed put, planning to establish a temporary nest here. He expanded the small makeshift underground chamber several times over, digging dozens of tunnels that branched in all directions, some leading to the surface, others to unknown areas, and even a few descending deeper underground. He also carved out small chambers at various points in the tunnels, though they weren't immediately useful. Some tunnels ended in dead ends, purely as decoys. Several of the tunnels were especially spacious, designed as emergency escape routes for transporting the brood nest. These routes featured numerous branches to add to their complexity. Whenever he got hungry, Luo Wen brought the brood nest to the surface to drink sap from the tree roots. He would also bite off segments of root for the brood nest to absorb later. When he got tired, he simply lay down next to the brood nest and slept. After one such rest, Luo Wen woke to discover he had gained a new ability. He could secrete a sticky substance from his mouth. This secretion could be used to bind soil together, making it sturdier. Is this evolution's way of telling me to never leave the ground? So many abilities tailored for burrowing and hiding. Luo Wen grumbled. Still, an ability was an ability. Using the brood nest to analyze it, Luo Wen discovered it came from genetic fragments of the black ant, which was apparently a master burrower. Despite his complaints, Luo Wen enthusiastically used his new ability to reinforce the room housing the brood nest, making it sturdier, though the process left his mouth dry. Over the next few days, the now detached brood nest grew noticeably larger. Luo Wen began to suspect it was siphoning off the energy meant for producing insects to fuel its own growth. The brood nest had grown so large that Luo Wen now struggled to move it. If this continued, his wide escape tunnels would become useless. Upon investigating, Luo Wen realized the problem was his own doing. The first insect he had designed was based on the black beetle war god. Luo Wen had further enhanced it by adding digging appendages and replacing its short antennae with longer ones for better sensory capabilities, reducing the risk of ambush. However, this design drastically increased the material and energy requirements. The real issue was that the war god was over 10 times Luo Wen's size. For the brood nest to hatch such a creature, it first needed to grow even larger than the war god itself. Upon realizing this, Luo Wen cursed the rigid operating system of the brood nest. Couldn't it be more flexible? All the energy he'd painstakingly gathered had gone into its unnecessary growth. But the brood nest, being a mechanical-like production factory, showed no signs of appeasing its creator. It silently conveyed its indifference. If you don't want to keep me, just leave me here to fend for myself. Go ahead, I dare you. In the end, Luo Wen caved. Abandoning the brood nest was not an option. He quickly revised his orders, instructing the brood nest to hatch a scaled-down version of the war god instead. Meanwhile, Luo Wen took the opportunity to survey the surrounding area while digging tunnels. He found no immediate threats, so he grew less vigilant about constantly dragging the brood nest around. Besides, its increasing size made that impractical. He dug a hidden chamber adjacent to the large room housing the brood nest, leaving only a small entryway that he could barely fit through. Luo Wen crafted a makeshift door using his sticky saliva and sealed the entrance every time he left. After a few tries, his technique improved to the point where the door fit seamlessly, leaving no visible traces from the outside. Luo Wen reflected on his apparent talent for anything related to digging. The brood nest's increased size wasn't entirely a downside. It could now chew through tree roots faster and convert energy more efficiently. Luo Wen hesitated, would making the brood nest even larger be beneficial? But if it grew any bigger, he'd lose the ability to move it entirely. For now, the current size was sufficient. Luo Wen decided to focus on hatching a few insects to see their effectiveness before making further plans. 2 days later, the brood nest finally accumulated enough energy to begin hatching its first insect. The hatching process took an astonishing amount of time. After another 2 days, the brood nest spat out a black beetle-like insect, exactly as Luo Wen had envisioned. Or perhaps sprayed would be a more fitting term. One side of the brood nest split open, and the insect emerged amidst a torrent of viscous fluid, splattering onto the ground. Fortunately, Luo Wen had anticipated this and widened the room's entrance. Otherwise, the newly hatched beetle would have slammed against the wall. After ejecting the insect, the brood nest rapidly deflated, resembling a punctured balloon. Luo Wen panicked. "Is this thing a one-time use?" he muttered anxiously. A quick inspection revealed that while the brood nest wasn't permanently damaged, the process of hatching the black beetle had drained it severely. It would need significant time and energy to recover. Even the brood nest has to go on maternity leave. Luo Wen sighed in frustration. 2 days to gather energy, 2 days to hatch, and then an extended recovery period. At this rate, when would he ever amass the insect army of his dreams? Was this what the power of the collective was supposed to mean? It felt more like a trial designed to exhaust him to death on his way to ultimate evolution. Despite his disappointment, Luo Wen suppressed his frustration and turned his attention to the newly hatched black beetle. He could only hope it wouldn't let him down. Chapter 20, Flaws. The black beetle, still lying in a pool of viscous fluid, struggled to its feet. It was slightly larger than Luo Wen, modeled after the war god beetle. With a pair of massive mandibles, extended antennae for better signal reception, and an additional pair of digging limbs, it now boasted 4 pairs of legs instead of 3. Looking at the creature before him, Luo Wen couldn't help but marvel at the wonder of evolution. His frustration began to ease. In his previous life, even with humanity's advanced technology, creating a living creature like this combining various insect organs seamlessly would have been impossible. Unless, of course, you glued together pieces of dead insects. But this one was alive. And judging by its movements, all its newly added organs worked flawlessly without any signs of incompatibility. However, as Luo Wen observed the beetle, he realized something awkward: he couldn't communicate with it. This revelation was both shocking and frustrating. Who would have thought that after all the effort, after nearly wrecking the brood nest, he'd end up with a creature that couldn't even understand him? Luo Wen wondered if insect communication was required, but he had never learned any insect language. Luckily, while the beetle couldn't communicate, it also didn't attack him. Perhaps this was because its original form, the war god, was herbivorous. Then again, it seemed unlikely. Even as a herbivore, the war god was known for its violent temperament. Luo Wen hadn't given it the nickname lightly, it had earned it in countless direct confrontations, proving itself the strongest combatant he had encountered among insects. If the beetle was hostile, Luo Wen would already be in trouble. Instead, the situation suggested the brood nest had programmed the beetle with a built-in friend or foe recognition system. But why was the communication system malfunctioning? Luo Wen thought carefully. The brood nest had evolved from fragments of queen ant genes. This was no longer just speculation, he had confirmed it by examining the brood nest's genetic library. Some of these gene fragments had likely come from black ants, though Luo Wen couldn't be sure. Ant colonies operated with impeccable coordination, implying they had some form of communication. If Luo Wen's queen ant genes originated from black ants, perhaps he also inherited the genes responsible for their communication system. With this in mind, Luo Wen quickly examined the brood nest. Thanks to its indirect access to his genetic library, he could investigate this issue more thoroughly. Fortunately, there weren't many gene fragments in his library, a bittersweet fact. While it highlighted how limited his genetic resources were, it also saved Luo Wen a lot of time. Among the black ant gene fragments, there were 3 notable ones. Queen ant genes, which influenced the development of the brood nest. A gene related to the secretion of formic acid, linked to his recently acquired sticky saliva ability. A gene that allowed the secretion of pheromones, though its function was still unclear. Luo Wen hypothesized that formic acid, while useful for construction, was unlikely to have communication capabilities. Still, he decided to test it just in case. He spat a few globs of saliva at the black beetle. It showed no reaction. As expected, formic acid wasn't the solution. Or perhaps his saliva wasn't pure formic acid. It seemed to contain additional genetic traits from camouflage bugs, whose secretions were used to glue leaves onto their bodies. This left the pheromone-secreting gene as the most likely candidate for communication. Unfortunately, Luo Wen had overlooked this gene when designing the black beetle and hadn't included it in its blueprint. Meanwhile, the black beetle had recovered from its initial post-birth weakness and was now aimlessly wandering around the brood nest's chamber. It almost looked like it was patrolling. Could it be instinctively protecting the brood nest? If so, at least it had some utility. The black beetle's massive mandibles, now adorned with spikes, made it a formidable fighter despite its lack of intelligence. In direct combat, it was probably even stronger than Luo Wen. With the beetle guarding the brood nest, Luo Wen felt more comfortable venturing further afield to explore. Wasting no time, Luo Wen replenished his energy and brought back 2 tree roots. He fed one to the brood nest, but the black beetle unapologetically snatched the other, as if expecting Luo Wen to provide for its needs. Luo Wen cursed under his breath but let it slide. After all, there was no point in arguing with a bug that couldn't understand him. He decided to treat it like a guard dog. After carefully sealing the brood nest's chamber, Luo Wen glanced at the black beetle, which was busy gnawing on its root and oblivious to his actions. Without further delay, he headed for the surface. It had been a while since he'd roamed above ground, thanks to the brood nest weighing him down. The fresh air felt invigorating after so long underground. The surface was far more dangerous than the subterranean world, but Luo Wen had his advantages in both environments. Underground, his rapid digging speed made him nearly impossible to catch. However, his detection range was limited, relying on fine hairs to sense vibrations. This left him vulnerable to stationary threats. Additionally, his speed underground came at the cost of maneuverability, and prolonged digging could damage his compound eyes. Above ground, Luo Wen's sharp vision gave him a significant edge. While most insects were practically blind, he could see clearly over long distances. Stealthy predators like ambush worms, stink bugs, and camouflaged bugs posed less of a threat, as Luo Wen had learned to anticipate their tactics. His highly responsive compound eyes made it nearly impossible for them to catch him off guard. Despite the risks, Luo Wen enjoyed surface exploration. If danger arose, he could always retreat underground, where he excelled. He began circling the brood nest's location in a clockwise pattern, gradually expanding his patrol radius. He was on the lookout for any potential threats, small ones he could eliminate and larger ones he could prepare to escape from. His antennae picked up faint insect noises, and 2 sources stood out within his observational range. Both were black beetles clinging to a tree trunk, their cries sounding almost hysterical. Luo Wen had no intention of provoking them. These creatures were a force he couldn't handle right now. Fortunately, they were herbivores and posed no immediate threat as long as he left them alone. On his 3rd patrol circuit, Luo Wen spotted an ideal target, a perfect subject for experimentation.